Patrick Henningsen and TNT.
All right, folks, welcome back. We're in hour number 1 of this live broadcast, live and direct here on TNT Radio.live. Great to have you guys with us. Great to see the numbers building up in the TNT chat community. You can just go to TNT Radio.live and look in the lower right-hand corner. There's a red bubble. Just click on that. That'll get you into the chat room. That's where we want to be during the broadcast. A lot of great information, a lot of fun happening there during the program. A lot of you guys like being in there. You love the banter. You love the camaraderie, and we love you, our audience. Now, I want to welcome onto the stage a very special guest is joining us from the heart of Europe, Scandinavia to be more precise. Mats Nilsson is a historian, also a political commentator. He's joining us right now from Europe. It's late where you are, Mats, and we appreciate you joining us. The big news right now in Eastern Europe, anyway, one of the big events on the calendar is Victory Day, May 9th. And the scenes in Red Square. It's a very important day in Russia. A lot of Eastern European countries not celebrated in exactly the same way in the West. It doesn't have the same gravitas, this event on the calendar, Mats. And I think you'll agree with me that World War II is viewed through a very different lens depending on what part of Europe you're from. And I think this is a big disconnect. And maybe this is a source of a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunication, especially between the West and Russia. But I want to get your thoughts on Victory Day as a retrospective and how it relates to us today.
I think this is where history and propaganda meet, so to speak. We can even see that on the fact that there is a disconnect between what day Victory Day is celebrated. I remember, for example, in Sweden on, I think it was May the 6th, celebrations broke out. Peace celebrations broke out. My grandfather told me, because he took part in the peace celebration at Kungsgatan in Stockholm. He went out into the streets and started celebrating Victory Day. Well, one day ahead of May 7th or May 8th, which was later perceived as the Western European Victory Day in Europe. And then later, of course, May 9th as the WWII Day in the Soviet Union, and then later Russia, became the day for celebrating victory over the fascist Germany. And of course, we have to remember this was just Victory Day in Europe. The god-awful war continued on for another few months until America felt the need. It needed to prove itself and drop the 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And we can have a discussion about if that was necessary or not. We'll just leave that and stick to Victory in Europe Day. But it's for all intents and purposes, as soon as the guns hadn't even stopped shooting before certain generals within the Western allies started speaking about going on towards the Soviet Union and quickly attacking the Soviet Union. I think quite a few of us have read about General George S. Patton being quite adamant about now is the time to strike against the Soviet Union while they are still weak from having defeated fascist Germany, when he inadvertently admitted that the defeat of fascist Germany was, for all intents and purposes, borne on the shoulders of the Soviet soldiers, be they Ukrainian, Belarusian, Kazakh, or Russian soldiers marching towards Berlin. Of course, the Western and especially the American aid to the Soviet Union had a lot of impact on the victory, but suffice to say it was the Russian and the Soviet soldiers who did the bleeding and was aided by the equipment that they received. So I would say it's politics. And in Russia today, of course, Victory Day has been enhanced. I would be lying if I am not saying that Victory Day on May 9th is now also used as propaganda for the Russian leaders. Propaganda is everywhere. I think, but we in the West, I think we in the West have to admit to ourselves that we use propaganda just as much as anyone else. And as for May 9th, it's a perfect opportunity for Russia today to remind the world of the sacrifices that the Soviet Union and in a large part Russia made in defeating Germany, which of course is met by silence in the West, because the West doesn't really want to remind the world that Russia and the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the massacres in civilians and soldiers during World War II. I think Belarus was the country that suffered the most percentage of civilians killed during the Second World War. But that's, of course, nothing you want to discuss and nothing that you want to highlight in Western Europe. I don't think there was any Swedish mainstream newspaper who had any article relating to the sacrifices of the Soviet Union on May 9th. It was just met with quiet. And it's sad, really, because this would be an opportunity to seek common ground. But instead, the differences are enhanced. And we're stuck, as we always are, with the East and the West, and animosities building, and the war in Ukraine continuing as always.
I think what's interesting about this conversation, Mats, and you may or may not agree with me, depending, because I know people have very different attitudes, depending on what part of Europe you're in terms of your relations with, let's say, Russia, for instance. But the Russians do acknowledge that they were allied with the U.S., with the Allied forces, and they do view it as a collaborative effort to defeat Germany and defeat the Axis powers during the Second World War, but they also are, cognizant of the sacrifice that they had to make. It really speaks to the they use this as a reminder of their resilience and their determination as a nation, and that's so May 9th is really important on the calendar in Russia for that reason, and it kind of it reflects forward in history with what they're currently undergoing right now with the Donbass and with Ukraine and NATO and so forth. Again, they want to reiterate this. They want to reinforce this idea in the present day. And I can understand the sacrifices made in terms of the sheer numbers of losses on the Russian side. I don't know what the numbers are, but civilians in combat totaling somewhere around 25 million plus. So when you're talking about numbers like that, that does echo and reverberate forward in history. And it's very difficult to sort of, write that one off, say, oh, yeah, that was a long time ago, because everybody is affected in some deep and profound way by that. So I see this as it just takes on a whole nother level of gravity for Russia. And this is why I think this holiday is still very important. What do you think about that? Do you think they
Yes.
still feel there's a chance that fighting could break out again, given certain circumstances in Europe?
Of course, Russia believes this, and I think one thing that struck me was that a lot of Western media, including some Swedish media, were making fun of the fact that the only tank that drove across the Red Square during the military parade was the T-34. Now, that speaks, as you said, that speaks volumes about how certain Western journalists and Western commentators fail to realize the significance of this war for the Russian people and the Russian understanding of themselves and how they identify themselves. This single T-34 tank told everyone within the Russian sphere of influence or within the Russian community globally that Russia will not be defeated now as they weren't defeated then, because they will start making new T-34s or whatever the iconic tank of the current day and age is, because the T-34 is a symbol and was a symbol for the fact that Russia didn't give in. No matter what the cost, the motherland was always going to be defended. And you have to remember that the motherland during World War II shedded most of its communist layers, because what Stalin did quite early on during the Second World War, when Russia and the Soviet Union was attacked, he said, you can once again start using the imagery of the former Russian republics. You can once again start to talk about Nevsky. You can once again start talking about Peter the Great. You can once again start talking about Suvorov and the generals that defeated Napoleon and generals that defeated the Turks, and so on and so forth. Meaning that once Mother Russia is threatened, the ideologies just disappears. And once again, no matter how much, I think almost no matter how much Russian Western liberals hated Putin before this war in Ukraine escalated, now they will have moved to stand behind the idea of once again protecting the motherland. So the West has unified Russia, as we've spoken about before, with the sanctions, with the war of aggression, with all the military supplies that are handed to Ukraine. They've basically served Russia a silver platter of unification and of newfound strength. It's May 9th will always reverberate in history, in the history books of Russia. And there are still people alive today who fought in that war, as we saw on the podium. And these people are still icons within the Russian community. And there is nothing the West can do to try and bring down the feeling of pride within Russia for the sacrifices made, and trying to make fun of it, by calling it, oh, just one tank, that's all Russia have, and so forth and so on. It's just going to further solidify the Russian people against the West, or at least for as so long they feel the need to fight off a Western perceived aggression. It's perfect propaganda, and once again the West is failing to understand Russia and the idea that has built Russia through the centuries.
Yeah, that is, you make a really important point, Mats, is that in the new iteration of the Russian Federation, they can invoke the old great war heroes in the Russian Empire in history, whereas during Soviet times, that frame was much more limited because of ideology and politics. So this does reinvigorate the idea of Mother Russia in a much bigger timeline. I think that's really important. I had quite a profound experience, Matt, recently when I had an opportunity to have some historical and also cultural experiences in learning about Belarus when I went to Minsk recently. And I had no idea of the role that country played in the Second World War of, eventually breaking the back of the Nazi army as it was occupying that country for almost 3 years. but the partisan rebellions in the notorious forests, thick wooded areas of Belarus, became very difficult for the Nazis, occupying Nazis, to manage. They had 2,000 internment camps Germany was running at any point in time during the course of that occupation. And I believe their losses, Mats, including everybody in camps and otherwise, 2.3 million. 2.3 million in around a 3-year period. I mean, just think of the for a small country like this. I mean, it's just unspeakable. But it's hardly a footnote in the conversation of World War II unless you've studied it or seen the films. Many iconic films have been made about the partisans in Belarus and so forth, and the rebellion against the Nazi occupation. But outside of a very, I think, very small, narrow portal, there's not much in the conversation there, and I find that to be extraordinary because you can't understand the people in this part of the world without understanding their story, and this is a big part of their national story, and hence they spend a lot of time and energy in presenting this story. I went to a village, infamous village called Hatyn, I think I pronounced that correctly, where the people in the village were put into a barn and burned alive by the Germans, and the area has been preserved. There's no buildings left. There's just monuments there. But people make that pilgrimage, and schools and so forth. It's part of the educational experience in Belarus. But again, Mats, I never really heard that story in all my years. It's just extraordinary. But your thoughts?
Well, for me, as a Swede, we've always been quite, or from since you're young, when you're taught in school about the Vikings going and, for all intents and purposes, establishing the Belarusian and Rus, or establishing the Rus Empire, which back then included current Ukraine, Kiev, and Belarus. And the Vikings and the Swedish kings were intermarried with the nobility of these areas since the 8th or 9th century onward, up until around 1200, when the Golden Horde started to move in and occupy these parts. So we've always been aware that there have been a Belarus, and as for Belarusians, their identity, it's of course been difficult for them to break free from Russia, seen as what they gave to defeating the German armies during World War II. But I think if I've been to both Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. I've been there, and as I've told you before, I lived in Russia during the 1990s, and I think Belarus has a sense of pride for what they did. I mean, in the swamps and in the forests and the partisans of Belarus, there have been so many movies made about these partisans giving, essentially forcing the Germans to deviate large amounts of support troops to guarding not the trade routes, the supply routes towards the front lines. And as they did so, they had ample opportunity to take out lots and lots of German material and lots of German soldiers. And they were recognized for this and for their fight against Nazism. And today, of course, they're in the shadows somewhat of Russia proper today. But I think the Belarusian people most have a firm understanding and pride in what they contributed with in defeating the Nazis. And also, as we've seen, there have been clips on Telegram, the Telegram channels, concerning old people in Ukraine with a Soviet background who were directly involved in the Second World War, or who were children of people who were affected by the Second World War, trying to celebrate May 9th in Ukraine. As you know now, May 9th in Ukraine is now Europe Day, as it is in the rest of Western Europe. May 9th is Europe Day. And of course, there were European Union flags in Ukraine. Meanwhile, these few remaining veterans and these few remaining older people who have a direct linkage to the Second World War were shoved off the streets and the places of memory in Ukraine. And also, I think there were a few memorial services that were supposed to be held in certain Russian Orthodox churches in Ukraine that was also forcibly closed, saying that this was not something concerning the fight against fascism and Nazism. It was a pro-Russian manifestation. And once again, it only goes to prove that history is always partly propaganda. And Ukraine, of course, is desperate as not to be reminded about the fascist past. And suddenly you're having discussions about Bandera and the Western Ukrainian support for Nazi Germany. And that's a discussion that Zelensky, of course, doesn't need right now, especially since what many commentators are saying, Russia has initiated a thrust towards Kharkiv in Ukraine, just the recent 24 hours. So right now, I think there's a lot of discussion with mild to severe panic going on in Kiev. But they're still playing. They're still playing their part. When Mrs. Metsola was in Kiev today, of course, they were having a speech out in the open, and there was an air raid siren. Always an air raid siren when the dignitaries come, and you have to. The camera has to make some shaky movement when they're rushing towards the shelter. But it's of course Russia doesn't want to kill Zelensky. Russia believes that Zelensky is the worst, best leader that Ukraine can have from a Russian perspective. I don't think anyone. I think actually, if Kiev was to learn that someone was plotting to kill Zelensky, I think the Kremlin would probably help save Zelensky, just to keep him there, to keep him in power, because he's a godsend gift to the Russians, the way he's handling things, or not handling things as it is right now. It's I just feel sorry for him because sadly I believe he might not get through this alive in the coming months ahead. And it's not that I particularly love Zelensky, but he's still a human being, and I don't want to see him go the same way Ceausescu did. I wish he gets an escape somehow. But that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah. Well, you're right, Matt. The last thing Russia would want to do is interrupt Zelensky in this slow, glorious train wreck that he is currently commandeering, and makes their job kind of easier on the public relations battle as well. So yeah, very aptly put there. And I agree with you. I'm on your side on that in terms of Zelensky. He is a tragic figure, Matt, in the historical sense, unparalleled actually in modern times. And this Faustian tale will eventually come to an end, and then will become part of history at that point. But it's fascinating. Mats Nilsson, historian, political commentator based in Sweden. Thank you for joining us on TNT this week. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Great historical perspective from Mats Nilsson, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll be sharing that clip on our X feed tomorrow as well. Listen, top of the hour news headlines coming up right now. We're going to connect on the other side with the great Benjamin Rubenstein to get an inside scoop on this question: America's lost colony. Where is it? Who is it? You know what I'm talking about. All that and more coming up. Stay with us.